Wonderful. Hi, everyone. We are going to give ourselves a few extra minutes just to allow as many people to join as we are able. We had quite a robust registration, so I imagine that folks will be trickling in throughout the event. But we are planning to begin our conversation on sexual citizens right at 7:05. This is wonderful. I am loving this chat box already. Welcome everyone from around the country. This is exciting to have a coast to coast conversation on sexual citizens. For those who have just joined, I just wanted to let you know we are planning to start at 7:05. So we're going to take a couple more minutes just to let a few more folks trickle on. But we are excited to have you joining us. We do need to figure out what's going on in Little Rock, and we will fix that error. All right, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for this important conversation. I am so glad to have you all here. And it looks like we have a full house, which is wonderful. So I want to go ahead and get started so that we have time for our conversation and to leave plenty of time for our audience to be able to ask any questions as well. Let me introduce myself. I am Christine Soyong Harley. I am the President and CEO of SIECUS, Sex Ed for Social Change. SIECUS was founded in 1964 to be the leading voice for shame-free education on human sexuality and a champion for sexual and reproductive freedom as an essential part of the human experience. SIECUS asserts that sex education is a powerful vehicle for social change. We are the only national organization that is solely focused on advocating for the rights of all people to have accurate information, comprehensive sex education, and the full spectrum of sexual and reproductive health services. At SIECUS, we believe that sex education can spark social change and at the nexus of many social justice movements, from racial justice and LGBTQ rights to the Me Too movement and urgent conversations around consent and healthy relationships. This is why we are so excited to host today's conversation on sexual citizens, preventing sexual assault on college campuses. This conversation is so timely as parents and students everywhere are anxiously awaiting news about how their schools and colleges will handle the start of the new school year, and as we as a country continue to grapple with sexual misconduct as a widespread concern in our society. But before we begin, let me go over a few housekeeping items so that we know how to participate in today's event. As you know, we're using Zoom webinar, which means that all participants are muted and cameras are turned off. However, please continue to feel free to chat in the chat box as you have been. Continue to share where you're joining us from so that we can, see the international spread of participants. In addition, there is a Q&A box, and so we also invite you to submit your questions in that Q&A box. This will be moderated by my colleague, Amy Jenkins, who will be able to help pull audience questions during the Q&A portion of the event. We will do our best to answer as many questions as we can. If we're not able to respond, we will do our best to collect unanswered questions and provide you with brief responses if we're able to. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available to all of those who have registered for the event. And we plan to host the recording on SIECUS's website at www.siecus.org. The recording should be made available publicly sometime early next week. I also wanted to note that as with many nonprofit organizations, the coronavirus pandemic and the economic uncertainty has impacted SIECUS and the support for our work. This event is an opportunity as a fundraiser for SIECUS, so we encourage you to visit www.siecus.org/donate to make a contribution so that SIECUS can continue to work with federal, state, and local governments and schools to advance comprehensive sex education programs and policies. I also wanted to note that you can purchase a copy of Sexual Citizens, if you haven't already, through the SIECUS website with special discount codes from Politics and Prose, which is a local DC-based bookstore, and through Norton, both of which are providing discounts if you would like to purchase. So you can go to siecus.org/webinars to find these special discounts. And then lastly, before we begin, it's important to note that our discussion of sexual citizens will contain descriptions of actual sexual assaults as students experience them. This material may be hard to listen to, and we know that in every room, virtual or not, there are survivors. So throughout the event, we will be sharing the RAIN hotline number in the chat window. So please make sure that you take care of yourselves and know that you're not alone. That RAIN hotline number is 1-800-656-HOPE 4673. Okay, so with all of that shared, I am super excited to turn to our speakers and to get started with this conversation. We are joined this evening by two authors of Sexual Citizens, a landmark study of sex, power, and assault on campus, Jennifer Hirsch and Shamus Khan. Jennifer Hirsch is the professor of socio-medical sciences at the Mailman School of Public Health at Columbia University. Her research spans 5 intertwined domains: the anthropology of love, gender, sexuality, and migration, sexual, reproductive, and HIV risk practices, social scientific research on sexual assault and undergraduate well-being, and the intersections between anthropology and public health. And so she's bringing all of that expertise into this book. Jennifer has been named one of New York City's 16 heroes in the fight against gender-based violence, and in 2012 was named a Guggenheim Fellow. Shamus Khan is a professor and the chair of sociology at Columbia University. He's one of the core faculty in Columbia's Population Research Center at the Mailman School of Public Health, and is a member of the executive committee of the Institute for Women, Gender, and Sexuality, as well as the program in American Studies. He works in the areas of cultural sociology and stratification with a strong focus on elites, and most recently has been working on the Sexual Health Initiative to Foster Transformation, or SHIFT, which seeks to understand sexual health and sexual violence at Columbia and Barnard communities, which is discussed throughout the book. So welcome to you both. Thank you so much for being here. We are so excited to have this conversation with you. So let's go ahead and jump right in. And so why don't you just start off by sharing with us why you decided to write this book?
Well, before that, just thank you so much, Chris. It is an honor and a delight to be here with you and with the SIECUS community tonight. So I'll start with the story. Austin, in many ways, was a very sympathetic character, a young man who caught our attention for his commitment to his girlfriend's sexual pleasure. He told a story about a night they spent together. It's kind of the only really hot sex scene in the book, and I'm not going to say that much about it other than to say that he and his girlfriend made their own fireworks. He actually had a series of nicknames for the kinds of orgasms that she would have. And yet he told us a different story about a time early in his time at Columbia when he, in the way that students are sort of shuffled around into each other's rooms, his roommate wanted to be alone with his roommate's girlfriend, and so he was sent off to sleep in the roommate's girlfriend's room. And there was a girl there, and she was drunk, and she mumbled to him that she didn't want to do anything, as if like, why should you even need to establish when a stranger comes into your room that you're not interested in them? And he didn't listen to her. He instead got in bed with her and started to touch her body. And then he stopped himself. He was like, nah, this isn't the thing. He had never labeled that a sexual assault until he sat down to talk with us several years later. And in recounting it, he still resisted the label. And then later in the interview, when he was asked, well, what's a sexual assault? He said, well, it's when you touch someone without their permission. And then he paused and his eyes welled up with tears. And he was like, and you'll pardon my language, but he said like, fuck me, because he was wrecked because that wasn't the person that he had become. And so we wrote Sexual Citizens to help people not do that, to change the national conversation. In 2014, when I was starting the Sexual Health Initiative to Foster Transformation, which we'll talk more about in a minute, the national conversation around sexual assault was really focused on adjudication, on sort of the campus as a hunting ground, and on the notion that there were bad people lurking. And there are bad people, but we take a public health perspective. And so our focus is on how the environment produces bad behavior. And so really the book changes the conversation to one that's about prevention, one that brings everyone into the solution to campus sexual assault, and one that looks at power in a way that is more complicated than just thinking we start with gender. You can't understand campus sexual assault without looking at gendered power inequalities, but we build on a feminist analysis by starting with intersectionality. So looking at how social advantage intersects with what we describe as situationally variable power disparities. That moment when he went into that girl's room, she was drunk, he was not. So what produced that moment? Our mission is to keep it from happening.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I have to say, you know, reading this book was powerful in that it felt like you got a really in-depth look at what college sex is like, but also what life in college in general is like. That the experiences that you describe are so specific, and yet also kind of reveal the complicated dynamics that students find themselves in. And you do this through these up close and really personal stories that students are sharing as they grapple with these complexities. And so I think it's so important to start with how you conducted your research, how you were able to get these intimate portraits of what it's like to be a young person today in college. And, you know, what was that experience?
So the Sexual Citizens is based upon the ethnographic portion of a much larger project, the ethnographic portion of this project that Jennifer and I co-led together. And the larger project, which Jennifer did with Claudette Mellons, was called SHIFT, the Sexual Health Initiative to Foster Transformation. And there were sort of three major components to SHIFT. There was a quantitative component, which had a series of quantitative studies, a random population sample of Columbia students, a daily diary that was a quantitative instrument that followed them over time. And then that was put in dialogue with our qualitative study, our ethnographic study, which had itself three major components. So the first was we interviewed 151 students, and these were sort of 2-hour interviews about their experiences in life, sort of broadly conceived, like what high school was like, their experiences with drugs and alcohol, their sexual experiences, and then getting them to describe different kinds of sexual experiences that they'd had, as well as experiences with sexual assault. And for some of the students, actually for 25 of them, there was so much to talk about, so much actually sexual assault experiences to talk about, that we did up to 3 rounds of interviews. So spending 6 hours with them gathering their stories. And so that's a big part of Sexual Citizens. And the way that we write the book is kind of through this narrative of experience. And part of the reason why we begin our conversations with these content warnings is because we talk about the experiences that these young people described to us. There's sort of 2 other things that we did as part of the ethnography. The second was to run a bunch of focus groups to see how students talk to one another about sex. And then I think what kind of sets it apart was the participant observation. And participant observation sort of starts from the perspective that you can learn a lot from listening to people tell you their stories, but you can learn more by actually being with them as those stories unfold. Now, obviously, there are limits to this. We didn't watch people have sex, but we did have, Jennifer and I spent a lot of time around campus in dining halls, at sporting events, at different kinds of public events. And then we hired a group of people who are significantly younger than we are and are capable of staying up after 11 p.m. And they
9:30.
9:30. Yeah. And they integrated into the campus social life. So they were in fraternity basements and sorority events. They were at campus parties, but they were also in sort of the broad spectrum of campus life. So, you know, they were in religious student organizations, in Christian Fellowship, in the Jewish Center. They were on sports buses. They were, you know, hanging out, making dinner with students. And we had spent hundreds of hours, our team, with people as they sort of navigated their day-to-day life. And this reflects a bit of our perspective, which is sort of trying to think about young people as whole people and understanding that we need to have a sense of their entire lives, the whole lives as they're trying to live them, in order to make sense of what they're trying to do with their sexual lives as part of those whole lives, as well as, you know, to put sexual assault not as an isolated experience, but instead as troubling as it may seem, as a predictable part of the way in which college and in some ways youth culture is organized today. And as difficult as that may sound, it actually also comes with a really hopeful approach. And reading the book is not easy. We'll fully admit that it can be challenging to read through these stories of assault. But the aim of the book is not to scare young people or to scare people who want to know what it's like to be a college student today. It's really written from a perspective of empathy and hope, that we don't want to sort of double down on the idea that the world is a scary place, that sex is a scary place, that sexual assault is going to happen to everyone who goes to college. Instead, we want to say, we need to understand these people and their whole lives in order to make sense of how it is that we can prevent sexual assaults from happening on college campuses today.
No,
Thank you for that. This is the joy of having conversation when we're all at home.
Mama?
It's just keeping it real. It's just
This is what life is like.
Good night, Mama.
It's bath time.
baths are important. We're very pro bath.
It would be clean. Thank you. Sorry about that, everyone. So I wanted to get to the three big ideas that this book is organized around: sexual citizenship, sexual projects, and sexual geographies. This is the lens in which you're describing sexual assault and how we understand it and the predictable nature of it, as you were speaking to, Shamus. Can you share how these ideas interact with each other and really what you're hoping is the big take home that we receive from this, from reading this?
So I'll tell another story from the book, and then Shamus and I together will pull out the threads of those ideas. And I'm very aware that these first two stories are cis hetero stories, and so we'll go on to complicate this, but I just wanted to acknowledge that in the beginning. So Lucy, this is sort of the paradigmatic campus sexual assault. This is what everyone imagines. Lucy was the first week of her freshman year. She had gone to boarding school, very sheltered. She was excited to party, to maybe be popular, to spend time with guys. She was hoping at some point to lose her virginity. She and her friend from her hall went to a bar. It's easy to, when you're a white girl with a fake ID, it's pretty easy to sneak into a bar in Morningside Heights. So even though they were 18, they went to a bar. They met some seniors who started buying them drinks, and the attention felt great. And, it was like, this was what she had been waiting for. And they danced, they made out, he invited her back to the fraternity. And so they stumbled up Amsterdam Avenue in the warm summer night. And then she wanted to wait. Her phone was ringing, and it was her friend Nancy who had gotten that bystander intervention. And Nancy was calling to check up on her. And so Scott was not super excited about waiting, but they waited for Nancy. Nancy met them at the fraternity, and they went up the steps, and he offered to make the girls drinks. Well, one of the rules at school is that you can't keep alcohol in a fraternity. You can't keep hard alcohol there. And that doesn't mean that it's not there. It just means that it's up on the second floor where it's hidden. And so they went up to the second floor. Remember, this is a building where he is surrounded by his friends, where at a school that he's been there for 3 years. He knows how people act. He knows what's embarrassing and what's not embarrassing. And so Nancy immediately passed out. And he asked Lucy if she wanted to go up to his room, and she did want to go up to his room. And they made out, but then he started to take her pants off, and she said, "No, don't." And he said, "It's okay." But it wasn't okay, because he raped her. And so in that moment, you can think, okay, Scott is a terrible person. And I mean, someone who doesn't hear a woman when she says no, like, yes, that is a terrible thing to do. But if all you do is stop with the judgment, that doesn't necessarily take you to prevention. And so the idea of sexual citizenship points people to the question of people's fundamental right to choose their own sexual experiences, and the understanding that other people have that same equivalent right. So when she said, no, don't, and he said, it's okay, he was erasing her sexual citizenship. He was saying she was not an equivalent human being. And so the question of sexual citizenship prods people. I think that, we have a problem in America acknowledging young people's right to sexual self-determination. And so the title of the book is a little bit of a provocation. We're saying to people, we can't get to a world with less sexual assault unless we can acknowledge that young people also have a right to say yes.
And so in addition to this idea of sexual citizenship, there are sort of the three legs to our kind of stool of our conceptual framework are sexual projects as well. And sexual projects emerges out of some of Jennifer's earlier work, where sexual projects are the answer to what is sex for? And at first that seems like the kind of question only a clueless academic could answer, but I'd actually encourage the listeners along right now, the people who are joining us, to say, like, answer for yourself. What's it for? And it's actually kind of a complicated answer. The answer is that sex is for lots of different things. Sometimes it's to give comfort to a partner. Sometimes it's to have a new kind of experience. Sometimes it's to sustain a relationship. Sometimes, hopefully, it's for pleasure. There are lots of reasons why people have sex. And understanding what people are trying to accomplish with their sexual lives is really essential to then understanding how it is that we might prevent sexual assault. And so we should ask ourselves, in the Scott and Lucy story that Jennifer just taught, what was Lucy's sexual project and what was Scott's? And in that story, clearly, Lucy's sexual project actually was kind of clear. She sort of knew sort of what she wanted: to make out with boys, to lose her virginity. And we use the language, by the way, of boys and girls because it's actually the language that college students use. They still refer to themselves not as men and women. There's this sort of way in which they still talk about themselves in that kind of language. But Scott's sexual project was really a sexual project based, at least from our perspective. We didn't have his story. We had Lucy's story, just in what he wanted. And just having a sexual project that is all about your pleasure isn't necessarily going to lead you to assault someone, but it might. It certainly is like not a good sign. And so the twin concept of sexual projects is sort of, what is sex for? That's the question. And, Jennifer and I aren't that judgy about people's sexual projects. Like, young people should live their best lives. Like, if they want to hook up, they should do so in ways that are respectful of other people. And that's where the second concept of sexual citizenship comes in, which is that, if you are seeking your own sexual pleasure as part of a project, you have to recognize the equivalent agency and humanity of the person you're with. You have to recognize their sexual citizenship. The third concept, and I know I'm going on for a bit, is sexual geographies. And this really brings power into a lot of our analysis, and it brings space into the analysis. And so the idea is that space structures our experiences. The example that we give often is to say, think about two young people walking into a dorm room. And maybe they've been hanging out together, flirting a little bit, and they decide to go back somewhere private. And the dorm room is their only option. They open the door to that room, and what do they see? A desk, a chair, a bureau, and a bed. If they're going to sit somewhere, where are they going to sit? Well, it's a little awkward to sit on the chair while the other person sits on the bed. And so they end up sitting on the bed together. But beds have meaning. And so part of the geography of campus experience is literally furniture and the ways in which those spaces help produce certain kinds of interactions. But other parts of the geography, again, thinking about the story of Lucy and Scott, are a geography where people have power in part because of their access to space. And if we think about campus life, there's a naturalization that older students get access to better space, which funnels younger students into spaces that older students control. And that empowers those older students. The older students often don't recognize that. Scott was in his fraternity. Why were they drinking in a fraternity? Well, by national rule, sororities can't serve alcohol and fraternities can. And this funnels people into spaces controlled by men. And so that spatial analysis that can bring in things like whiteness and control over space, and gender and control over space, and seniority over control over space, starts to give us a kind of, again, it's going to be an academic phrase, like an analytic lever to think about the ways in which space is central to power on campus and structures sexual experiences or deeply influences those sexual experiences.
Yeah, I really found the interaction of those three concepts to be just so insightful, particularly in how power gets kind of leveraged, both in terms of, how decisions are being made in terms of, an individual sexual project, and then how that gets manifested, right, through these other layers. And so, and I just appreciate these new concepts that you were able to, share out by exploring these things. As I mentioned above, at SIECUS, we've been talking about sex education as a potential to be a vehicle for social change. And so, I'm really interested in resonating with that, with this book, in exploring that potential for sex education to play this role in disrupting these kinds of dynamics that you're describing and the power that gets embedded within them. And so, while I know that, Sexual Citizens doesn't look at sex education as being, a sole solution for preventing sexual assault, I'd love to get your perspective on what you think the potential role is for sex education, what you learned about the potential for sex education in the students' stories that you were able to speak with.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much to say about sex ed, and it feels weird to talk to you about it because, like, I'm kind of new to this game, and SIECUS is, like, been this just incredible organization around it. And so I'm seeing in the chat that people are getting the book, and that's great. You should all definitely buy the book, but you should all support SIECUS too. So, like, also follow that link. And, in the stories that the students told us, it was really disheartening to hear about how students describe their sex ed. So some said, like, oh, sex ed, you mean my sexual diseases course? And, they described even those who claim to have had good sex ed. So these are people who got sex ed at all, sort of talked about the ways in which their sex ed was like just a fear-based, like, list of things about the problems with sex. So, like, here's a bunch of pictures of sexual diseases that you're likely to get if you have sex, or here's the consequence of sex, which is pregnancy, which is going to destroy your life. Like, you're going to become really poor now because you had a kid when you were younger. And, like, the entire experience of sex ed that most of the students had was really negative. And one group that we saw that particularly had this negative experience was the LGBTQ community. And it's important to note that, the LGBTQ community has the highest rates of sexual assault among any subgroup. And, the reasons for that are multiple. And, we find, Jennifer and I are really trying to expand the conversation beyond, like, toxic masculinity and rape culture. And talking about the LGBT community is a really good way to sort of have that conversation, because it's not toxic masculinity. Well, it might be a little bit, but, like, it's a little bit of a contortion to just make it about toxic masculinity or a rape culture within the LGBTQ community. Instead, one of the things that we consistently heard from LGBTQ students was how sex ed erased their identities, either their gender identities or their sexual identities. And they just really felt their kinds of experiences were not spoken about. And we think this puts them at risk of being assaulted. I'll say one final thing. We published a paper in PLOS, which is an academic journal. It's open. Anybody can access it. And it was led by the survey team and actually led by Jennifer's husband, John Santelli. And it had a really powerful finding in that paper. And the finding was this, that for women who had received comprehensive sexuality education that included practicing refusal skills, they were half as likely to be raped in college. It bears repeating, like women who received comprehensive sexuality education that included refusal skills were half as likely as other women to be raped. Now, some of this finding is like, we don't think that the sex ed just needs to be about teaching women refusal skills. Like, let's be very clear about that. Sex ed needs to do a lot more, but that is a huge effect. I mean, could be a massive prevention effort if we actually got everyone to experience something like that.
Yeah, I mean, it's essentially, that's about as effective as the flu shot. And if you think about the conversation around the flu shot and getting to herd immunity against influenza, as much as we don't think, there is no one solution to preventing campus sexual assault, because campus sexual assault is not one thing, but good, comprehensive, age-appropriate K-12 sex ed could get us a lot of the way there. It's as if we had a vaccine and we're just choosing to only let rich kids get it. That's that's the American way, right? So, I mean, I think another couple of things that we learned, sex ed, as you know, should have the qualities of all good education. So that includes both skills development, so helping kids talk about, well, first of all, think about what they do and don't want, giving them space to want things, but also develop the skills to talk about it. But then also critical thinking. I mean, nobody had taught Scott to check his power, or even maybe to be aware of his power. And so critical thinking about gender, about how social location might put you in a situation where you can inadvertently harm someone. That is a really powerful thing that sex education can do. I think we frequently use the metaphor of driving, which is funny right now because I'm totally failing at teaching my own kids to drive. But, there's a whole system in America, like driving is a pretty dangerous thing. And we, as a society, have done a pretty good job of teaching young people to do this relatively dangerous thing so that they can get where they want to go without hurting other people. And we don't let them grab the keys when they're drunk and turn away and think, oh gosh, I hope they make it okay, right? We have a whole system. And it's not teaching them how spark plugs work, right? And so sex ed that's focused on where are the ovaries? That's not what kids need. You know that, right? This is totally preaching to the converted. So we believe deeply in sex ed as a strategy to lift up young people's sexual citizenship. Sexual citizenship is really a social project. It's not an individual project. And so our goal in this conversation, using Scott and Lucy or Austin as an example, is not to blame them. It's that we need to take responsibility. We have failed as a society to cultivate in Scott a recognition of other people's sexual citizenship. And then, one final thing that I would say is that I think that there's not evidence, but certainly an indication that sex ed can really reduce perpetration, that good comprehensive sex ed has the potential to prevent the emergence of all the things that we know are associated with committing assault. And that's really our job, is to keep people from assaulting others. And so I think sex ed can do that. And this is where SIECUS, your role as the national leaders driving policy change, there is no one, everyone on the webinar, you might know this, but there is no other organization that is doing the national and state level work that SIECUS is doing in driving policy change. And so without SIECUS, there won't be that policy change. So I just want to put in one more plug about supporting SIECUS, because we're here because we love talking with you, but also because we have so much respect for the work that you're doing in the world.
Well, I appreciate that very much. I mean, I do feel like what stood out for me is just this opportunity to have really open, honest, frank conversations with young people about, you know, their own sexual projects, and being able to value that in its own right, but then also really honing this idea around sexual citizenship or sexual self-determination for young people. And then that is something that we miss so much in this society, but is fundamental for that prevention effort, right? That if Austin and Scott recognize the self-determination of the young women that they were, you know, in a situation with, right, that hesitation, that stopping point would occur much sooner and before harm occurred. And so, you know, I appreciate, you know, you really lifting that up throughout the book, and this opportunity that we are missing in having these kind of core conversations with young people, particularly those that, you know, sit at the margins of both race and sexual, their sexuality and gender identities. You know, that's actually the next thing that I wanted to ask you about. You write in Sexual Citizens that America's history of organized public action on sexual assault reveals that racial inequality has always been central to understanding both the circumstances in which sexual assaults occur and the meaning of confronting that violence. You speak about the, you know, how prevalent sexual assault is, particularly at that intersection of race. And I would love if you could, you know, speak a little bit more about what you were able to reveal about the way that race can influence the likelihood of sexual assault and why that may be, and, you know, how queer youth experience power and sexual citizenship differently. So I think these are really interesting nuances that your book touches upon.
So of the Black women that we spoke with in the interviews, every single one had experienced unwanted, non-consensual sexual touching. Every single one. And you can't understand that experience of having their bodies grabbed at without talking about racism, right? Like, so the session they get on consent, you know, freshman week it's not about racism, right? And so it's missing, like you fundamentally, we cannot prevent those sexual assaults, which are grounded in a lack of respect for the bodies of Black people, without grounding our prevention work also in an intersectional understanding of power inequalities. We also saw how Black men, the everyday experience of precarity that they lived as Black men in America, how that shaped their navigation of sexual intimacy. Carl told us a story, a heartbreaking story of a night when he typically didn't hook up with girls when they were drunk because it felt too dangerous to him. I think we came in the book to see drunken sex as a practice of white privilege because white men were, all other things being equal, less afraid of being accused of sexual assault. So Carl didn't have drunk sex, but there was a girl who was interested in him. To him, she seemed too drunk. And so they went for a walk and he walked around with her until she seemed less drunk. And then they went back to his room, but she still seemed too drunk to him. And he was like, no, this is not safe. And so, you know, by the time the sun was practically coming up, he's like, okay, well, she seems really, you know, this is going to happen. And they had sex. And then he recorded her saying that she'd had a good time. And he explained to us that he had looked it up. And New York is a state in which a recording made without the other person's permission is admissible as evidence in court. And so just imagine the feeling of precarity, I'll say again, that would lead someone to have to watch their back in that way. So the racial inequalities that students experience on an everyday basis, the ways that they saw Columbia and Barnard as fundamentally white institutions, it didn't just shape their education, it also shaped in really hard ways their social interactions.
And so, what Jennifer and I try and do in Sexual Citizens is build upon this long tradition of really important work that looks at gender and power and assault. But what we note is that gender is a massive form of inequality on college campuses, but it's not the only one. I mean, there are lots of other forms of power inequalities that are related to sexual assault. So Jennifer just told, stories of the experience of Black students, and the book is written in this sort of deeply intersectional way. So there's not like a chapter on Black students and then a chapter on queer students and then a chapter on, women and a chapter on men's experiences with assault. They're all the stories are interwoven together because we don't want to start from the perspective of there's the general experience of the cis white students and heterosexual students, and then there's everybody else. We try to put these stories alongside each other to sort of show the intersectional nature of power on campus and how important that is. And, I spoke earlier about the experiences of LGBT students. Two stories here. One, young man, we call him Adam. All the names, I don't know, Jennifer might have already said this, but all the names we use aren't real. We take pains to protect people's identities in telling their stories. Adam was from, Midwestern family that was pretty conservative, not at all open to his sexuality. And Adam got to campus and was really excited to be kind of away from that conservative family background, but also found the New York scene of gay men really kind of gross. And he was like, I'm really sick of men who just want to hook up or tell me that they're into a relationship and then just want to hook up and ghost me. And so he found this relationship and he was so happy to have found a relationship. It was so meaningful to him. And then, he told us a story about how his boyfriend was really forceful about sex. And he told us specifically about how one evening his boyfriend came home and his boyfriend was pretty drunk and he tried to stop his boyfriend from having sex with him. And then he said, but he basically raped me. And Adam had never spoken to anyone about this. He didn't tell his friends because he didn't want them to hate his boyfriend. He didn't talk to his boyfriend about it because he didn't want the relationship to be at risk. And, it's a different kind of assault that he's experiencing. And one of the points of the book is that assault isn't one thing. It's actually many different kinds of experiences. And it's why there's no real silver bullet for addressing it. But I think, in Adam's story, or we have other stories, the story of Maddie, who's genderqueer and transitioning, and whose partner, Maddie uses they, them pronouns. Their partner basically bullies Maddie into using their penis during sex. And, the experience of that is really identity invalidating for Maddie, but Maddie sort of understands in part where their partner is coming from and why their partner is doing that. And it points us again and again to the precarity that queer students experience, the fragility of their lives, the smallness of their communities, the ways in which they often want to give comfort to their partners because they themselves have lived through some of the fragility of queerness. And that puts them at risk of being assaulted. And the big take home from all of these disparate stories is equality is a sexual assault prevention strategy. That, if power inequality becomes essential for explaining assaults, moderating those power inequalities, fighting for equality, broadly conceived, is a way to try and prevent sexual assault.
Yeah, I mean, I was so struck by, your description of how for, LGBTQ students, for genderqueer students, that, their experience of being touched without permission, of being groped, of having their body parts touched, was experienced so dramatically differently, right, than heteronormative students who came to expect that kind of groping and unwanted touching may just occur. And what you were, saying about, I think, Carl, and, how, drunken sex, which is, described throughout your book as a reoccurring concern, is also, it sits at that intersection of white privilege and his, you know, need to safely, you know, navigate that because of, you know, of his race. And so I just feel like, you know, these kinds of power dynamics that you describe in your book are just so important for us to be able to understand, particularly within the, you know, the sex education context as well, right? These power dynamics are embedded within the ways in which we are understanding and allowing each other to experience our sexuality, and without being able to call that out as some of the power nexus within a healthy relationship, right? That we also create, you know, continue to create these situations that put students who are at these margins of these intersections, you know, at greater risk of harm. And so, you know, I appreciate as well that these, you know, three concepts that you identify really pull at, you know, how these things overlay and interact with each other in these different situations. So we've been talking for a really long time, for 45 minutes. I really want to make sure that we have opportunities to answer some of the questions that our audience has been asking. I feel like there are some really great questions here that I want to make sure that we are able to answer. So I'm just going to start with the top one. This is from Miriam Tabner. She writes, something I found to be profound in Sexual Citizens was the idea of identity characteristics. Oops, I'm missing. Identity characteristics. No, let me see if I can keep the scroll button up. Oh, did I go into answered? I just lost the question.
Do you want me to read it? I can see
Yeah,
it.
do you have it?
Yeah, so Miriam asked about the idea of identity characteristics associated with sexual violence, the way that we rethink perpetration,
Yes.
or reframe perpetration. She asked if all perpetrators are bad people, should we cancel them? Do they deserve to be punished? We step away from a carceral framework in Sexual Citizens. We cannot punish our way out of this problem. Any experience that is as commonly experienced as sexual assault is done by a lot of people. And so we are offering to the conversation is grounded in the idea of restorative justice. If people harm other people, then they need to, first of all, they need to be told that they're harming other people, which the current sort of legal adjudication framework doesn't create. There's no feedback mechanism. In fact, because there's only one hammer and it's a hard hammer, people are very reluctant to tell other people that they've harmed them. And so people go around hurting people without anyone telling. These are young people that we have failed to teach how to have sex without hurting other people. And then they just keep hurting them because no one is stopping them. But it's not stopping them punishing them. It's stopping them teaching to do better. Like, think about, there's a biter in every kindergarten class, right? And somehow, you know what? Like, by the time you get to work, there are no biters. So people are taught to restrain their aggressive impulses. And we're doing a pretty bad job of that with sex. We need to do a better job.
Mm-hmm.
And I also think, you know, that in this moment, in this conversation right now about policing and punishment and mass incarceration in the United States, we really need to have conversations between sort of the sexual assault arm of social justice movements and the carceral, you know, racial justice framework around this, because, you know, one of the really horrific things that's been experienced within Black communities has been this massive incarceration movement. And, you know, I think that there are a lot of lessons from the restorative justice framework here, that if we can begin to make connections between these communities and conversations, we may start from a better place. I do want to be clear, though, that like Jennifer and I we're sort of a stay in our lane sort of folks. So we are not lawyers. We're not, you know, we are not experts on the adjudication process at all. And part of our point is that, you know, the way to make this less likely to happen is not to get adjudication right. Like, if we just get the punishment right, the thing is going to stop. It's to prevent many of these things from happening. Because from our research and our perspective, what we found is that many of the events are not happening from serial perpetrator sociopaths. They're happening from like everyday people who are doing bad things. Don't get us wrong, but there are things that we could do in order to address that, in order to prevent sexual assaults from happening.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it was one of the things that struck me about Austin's story, right? That it was in the midst of describing to you his sexual experiences that he realized that he had done something that was harmful to another person. And then until he actually articulated that it hadn't resonated for him. And that just really struck me, again, as this failure of education and of conversation. And I think that, you know, this idea of how do we move into a restorative justice model, particularly when we're talking about, you know, sexual assault, is also resonant in this time where we're trying to think about, you know, how we are navigating policing in our community. So I appreciate very much that you raise that and really explore those ideas within your book. This is, I think, somewhat related. This is from Jennifer Baker. One of the things that she was hoping to learn as a non-researcher was whether all of the skepticism around the rates of campus sexual assault was wrong. And if so, have such figures or authors been retracted, come as, you know, or have has the problem been addressed seriously, or do the new changes to Title IX appear as a kind of victory for this group? And so this is sort of the opposite kind of question, I think.
We are not, this problem is not being solved. I'm not familiar with Yofi's work in Slate, but there is really substantial, consistent evidence that rates of sexual assault in college, that, you know, somewhere around a quarter or a fifth of women and a non-trivial proportion of men experience sexual assault in college. Rates of sexual assault for women in that same age group out of college are higher. No one ever talks about that. So we have a persistent and enduring problem with sexual violence in America, regardless of what any one article, like there's an overwhelming body of evidence, including good surveillance data from CDC. The CDC's surveillance data at high school kids shows really alarming proportions of kids in high school having experienced unwanted sexual contact. So this is, the problem is real. I think that where people get confused is the question of serial perpetration. And there is some controversy around that, but you know, our reading of the work is that the preponderance, that there's not, the real problem is not serial perpetrators, which doesn't mean that there aren't serial perpetrators. I think people would rather imagine a few truly awful people than consider the possibility that the people we love are hurting other people.
And I'll just add one very quick thing here, that when we say the rate of sexual assault, it includes many different things. So the rate of sexual assault on college campuses includes non-consensual sexualized touching, attempted, and successful rape. And so those are three different experiences. And, you know, I mean, in some ways, the 1 in 4 may seem really high, but in other ways, like to me, it seems very low. You know, we had one of our researchers experienced in the field someone walking up to her and rubbing his hand across her breast at a bar. And I was horrified to read this. And I kind of called her up and I said, why didn't you call me to tell me that this happened to you while you were out in the bar? And she's like, what happened? And I was like, you were sexually assaulted. And she said, it's just part of being a woman at a bar in New York City. Like she was, and I thought it was like a very eye-opening moment for me, because I was like, she had been researching sexual assault for a year by this point in time. And it was sort of something that didn't deserve commenting on because it was so common. And so, you know, I think the 1 in 4 statistic is, you know, in terms of the lived experiences of many people, actually probably wrong. And it's likely much higher. But, one last step back, and I know I said I was going to be short, that so much attention is on like the rate. What is the rate? What is the rate? What is the rate? And what Jennifer and I are trying to do in this book is say like, look, the rate question, we have like hundreds of different campuses with dozens of different studies that all produce the same rate. Like, we've got the rate. And in some ways, the rate doesn't matter. It's like, why is it happening? Like, what is the thing beneath the rate that's explaining it that we could address by transforming our communities to start making it less likely to happen?
Yeah. Yeah, it occurred to me, that, part of what you explore is how complicated and nuanced students' decisions are about how they handle a situation that they harmed in terms of their social circle and, the power dynamics that they're navigating. And that makes it, a very serious and potentially, upending decision, right? If they decide to report and to go through an adjudication process around sexual, adverse sexual experience. I wanted to ask this question from Susan Cruz, who writes, they teach sex education to high school students, including topics like consent, sexualized violence, and handling rejection. As part of consent, how can we make the conversation more realistic to college culture, like when alcohol and other substances are involved in preventing assault?
So one of the really fun aspects of this research, we had a group of undergraduates who advised us. We met with them every Monday morning at 8 a.m. and it was their job to guide us. They represented the diversity of the Columbia and Barnard undergraduate student body. And late in the research, we were sharing back some of the initial findings with us. And the thing that got the most snaps, was when we noted to them that students don't just happen to get drunk and then have sex, but that they frequently combine them on purpose. And some of that is driven by shame, right? I mean, there was the one young woman who said to us that getting drunk before hooking up was like the Novocaine before the dentist, that it was the thing that made it bearable for her to get through. But for some students, particularly white students who are less worried about underage drinking because they're less worried about the police, alcohol and sex go together like chocolate and peanut butter. It's just a fun thing that people do. And like, I don't know if you've ever been to a bar, but it is a fun thing that people do, right? People who are like out there in pre-COVID times. So I think that, again, stepping back from the moral panic, like, yes, there is a substantial proportion of assaults that are associated with alcohol, but there's also a substantial proportion of assaults that are not associated with alcohol. And I think part of so we need to talk about alcohol and sex for so many reasons, but we also need to talk about the non-intoxicated assaults because those are actually more likely to be experienced by students of color who drink less overall. And so when we focus again, and yes, we need to acknowledge that people have drunk sex. And I think maybe the message that we need to be giving young people is that when you are drunk and you have sex, you're at risk of assaulting someone, right? Because if you're a guy, you're thinking with your little head, not your big one, right? You're only thinking about how good it's gonna feel. So yes, we need to acknowledge that drunk sex is a risky practice in the same way that drunk driving is a risky practice. You could hurt someone. But we also need to expand what we think about when we talk about sexual assault to be more inclusive of the actual diversity of experiences that people have.
Mm-hmm.
And I just quickly on this also, I think like it's super important to think about how sex ed needs to connect with the other lessons that young people are getting all the time. And so sex ed that's siloed in a health class that presents sex as a health behavior is not going to be nearly as effective as sexual education that talks about sex as a social behavior that can make connections to all of the other lessons that young people get in their lives about what it means to treat other people with fundamental respect and human dignity. And so like the more bridges that we can build between sex education and general education, I think, the more likely it is that they're not just going to think about like sex ed as or sexual assault education as did I get a yes? And like, if I got a yes, then it's not assault.
Mhm. Yeah, no, I appreciate you very much raising that, Shamus. Erica asks about, how do we apply this framework around sexual projects, citizenship, and environments in a K through 12 setting, and getting your ideas on that? Because I think that, from our perspective, right, like starting, particularly, I think sexual citizenship projects, sexual citizenship as a concept for kids early on can create these building blocks to having these broader conversations. But I'd love to get your thoughts as well.
Yeah, I mean, great question. And just first, one of the things that is the strongest predictor of being assaulted in college is having been assaulted in high school. And so, college is it's too late to start having these conversations. Too late is probably wrong. Like it's never too late, but these conversations need to start happening much earlier. And, I feel embarrassed to say this in front of SIECUS because of all the work that you all do, but, good sex ed isn't about sex all the time. It's not always about what sex is. It's about other kinds of lessons. So let's take, the three concepts. Sexual projects is the idea of being clear with yourself and with others about what you want in your life and having a plan for how to enact it. And, that can be sex, but it can be lots of other things. Like, what are the various things that you want? And, how is it that they might be enacted? Sexual citizenship is very much about the rights to corporeal autonomy, the right to your own bodily autonomy. And these are lessons that we give people when they're, 2 years old. Don't shove or push or grab, use your words. And that is a sex ed education moment. And it's a moment that needs to be connected with other kinds of things. And so, talking to young people about their bodies and their right to bodily autonomy at a young age and other people's right to their bodily autonomy is part of sex ed. And so their sexual citizenship could be thought of as like their own bodily autonomy. And then finally, sexual geographies is about, spaces where they feel safe and also how spaces, especially later on, and I spent some time teaching in a high school, like understanding how you don't have to have power or necessarily feel like you're very powerful to use power against other people, and how your control over space or a range of things may empower you or make other people feel like they don't have the right to say no. And so I think providing moments of education about power and space, about the rights to bodily autonomy, about having clarity about your wants and desires, and respect for other people's wants and desires, those are lessons that can be done, I think, from the earliest ages. And then one of the critical things to do is to make sure that those lessons get connected to subsequent sex education, so that they're like, oh yeah, I learned all this before. Now it applies to sex, whereas before it applied to like that toy I wanted that somebody else had.
Mm-hmm. I think the only thing that I would add to that is that the book itself, I have a friend from college who teaches senior year English, and she taught Sexual Citizens alongside Tessa the D'Urbervilles and Catwoman, the short story. And the young people, high school seniors, used the ideas in the book to analyze fiction, but also to think about their own sexual projects and to think about instances in literature where people's sexual citizenship had or hadn't been respected. There was another young woman actually made a video about the Twilight series and what was Edward's sexual project. So I think that like the ideas in the book provide a framework for thinking about sex in a much broader way that advanced high school students, they're ready for those ideas.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Shameless plug. There was one question about COVID-19 that I wanted to, about that somehow got switched over, a question from Kim Schrader about the return to school plan and sort of sex in the COVID-19 era.
Yeah.
Shamus and I were just speaking with a reporter about this because our piece about sex and social distancing was apparently the only thing that's been written about sex and COVID-19 for students going off to college. And I said to the reporter, if you're really worried about your kid and COVID, make sure they don't go to choir practice or to a bar, right? So like, I think that we need to disaggregate the fear of young people's sexuality and the actual risk of COVID-19 and not make COVID-19 into like another scary thing, right? Like not only could you get a disease, but now you could kill someone's grandma, right? Like that's not a conversation that is going to be productive. I think that the social distancing does provide an opportunity for kids who are not super psyched to hook up to actually step back from that. And so again, like as parents, I think this is a moment where we can recognize our children's sexual citizenship. And that means making sure that they have all access to all the sexual health knowledge and technologies that they need to enact their sexual projects. I think that we can support their sexual citizenship by supporting the sleepover at home before they leave. I think that there is really no more powerful way that we can show our children that we see them as emerging adults than saying to them, yeah, you know, when you care about someone and they care about you, if they're ready to stay for dinner, then they're ready to stay for breakfast. Mm-hmm. I think that I don't like, we really want to push back hard against the moral panic around young people's sexuality and having that get caught up in the COVID-19 response. So again, like keep them away from choir practice and bars. Don't yak at them about sex.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it seems that one of the calls to action as parents is to be in practice of helping your children be able to identify their own sexual projects and to be able to speak about that clearly, right? So that they are both able to manage what that project is for themselves and to be able to communicate that in ways that are healthy and frank with, you know, potential partners. And I feel like that is, you know, one of these practices that we as a society aren't generally strong in and as parents are very afraid of. So that's a really good point to make. I wanted to ask Lily Rubenstein asked, based on your research and experience, what role do you see student activists having on campuses to change the conversation surrounding sexual assault generally, and generally for creating safer campus environments?
That's such a great question. I mean, you know, Jennifer mentioned that we had this group of undergraduate advisors, and that group was made up of, you know, the head of Greek life, and I know there was a question about Greek life too that maybe we should get to, as well as students who kind of by their own admission didn't do anything, and then two of the campus leaders of the kind of main Columbian Barnard, like anti-Columbian Barnard protest group, and who were engaging a lot with the university, criticizing their responses to the sexual assault cases. Mm-hmm. And, you know, I think Jennifer and I note in the introduction of the book that so much work has had to be done by activists who have been screaming since the 50s. I mean, you know, the first study of sexual assault on college campuses was done in 1953 and found really alarming rates of sexual assault. And, you know, since the dawn of coeducation, activists, primarily women, have been talking about this as an issue. And it's taken so long for it to become a part of the national agenda. And that has been incredibly important work. And I think, you know, I'm a little loath to like give advice to activists because I think, you know, they should like keep their foot down in applying pressure. But I think a few things that activists could think about as, you know, claims to make upon the university, in part drawing upon our own research. You know, the first is to build broad coalitions with other kinds of activist movements on campus that, you know, we mean quite seriously that you can't think about sexual assault without thinking about other forms of intersecting power, be that the experiences of queer students. You know, in the survey that was led by Claudette Mellons, one of the findings was that students who have difficulty paying for their basic needs were more at risk of experiencing assault. So, you know, class likely matters. And we find important, you know, racial effects. And this isn't Jennifer and I being sort of opportunistically responsible to the Black Lives Matter movement. You know, we were done with this book a year ago, and, you know, that's how long it takes for them to come out. And we were sort of talking about this centrality of race in what it was that we were seeing. And so I think one is to think about bringing in a range of other activist groups and to position sort of like groups of activists who do equity and inclusion work as part of their activism on campus as being part of a broad-based coalition, and that wins on racial justice and wins on, you know, class justice and wins for the LGBT community and wins for the sexual assault group are likely to have amplifying effects for all of the other groups. And so that would be the first thing I suggest. And then the second would be take space seriously. Like, take the idea of how space is allocated on campus really, really seriously. And one of the great sort of like cheerleaders for our work ended up being Scott Wright, who nobody knows who Scott Wright is except us, but he's the person who's responsible for facilities on campus. And he has a huge amount of power over how space is used on campus, but students never talk to him really about it. And so discovering like who is the space czar on campus and how could you go and talk to that person and be like, we want you to work to organize space differently. All the parties are in spaces controlled by men and mostly white men. Like, how can we change this? We want more spaces control, you know, and starting to enlist those people. And I have to say, like Scott Wright, the guy who's the space czar on our campus, you know, not a left-wing activist by any means, but he got it really quickly. And he was like, wow, I didn't realize that part of my job could mean helping prevent sexual assault. And so thinking, again, how you could enlist those different kinds of people might be really effective.
And I would just add a third piece of advice. I will give advice, which is that we want to see you in Albany, all you student activists. I think that to cast your eyes beyond the campus and use your power in state capitals to advance legislation, because, you know, as I think there's so much anger that is in some ways justifiably directed towards higher education, but it's our politicians who are really failing us, right? So like either get them to pass comprehensive sex ed legislation or let's get some new politicians.
Hear, hear. And, you know, November is less than 100 days away. So there's prime opportunity to make some changes. You know, we have time for maybe just one or two more questions. You know, Jennifer and Shamus, I don't know if there's one or two in particular that, you know, have struck you that you want to make sure that I ask, and feel free to call it out if I missed it.
I mean, I could answer the space question with a little more specificity. I think that there are different kinds of spaces that students need. So students need space to choose to have sex, right? So that means like, why is it that seniors get singles and freshmen don't? I was so like pushed to reorganize that. Students need spaces for identity groups so they can find comfort in people who have shared experience. Students need spaces for parties, which is different than program space. And then campuses need space where people can encounter each other across lines of difference. For most young people, higher education, at least young people in elite residential higher education, it is the most diverse institution they'll ever be a part of. And that's why a lot of them seek it out. And so if the campus funnels people only back into spaces where like meets like, that's a real missed opportunity. So I think that thinking about those four kinds of spaces and how they can be allocated to work against the grain of inequality instead of amplifying inequalities, that's the biggest lever that campuses can use to think about creating environments of less vulnerability.
Yeah. So I want to ask, I guess, these two questions. One is from Quadira Coles. Does the book talk about how society's negative responses to sexual assault survivors, like slut shaming, ignoring, or blaming, empower people to does society's negative responses empower people to assault with a sense of impunity? Is there a connection to that negative response and perpetration? I'd love to ask that, and then after that, I'd like to ask the question that Monica Nayak asks about a larger population research project.
Great. So I'll answer Quadira's question. We have a whole part of the book about like why people don't report or talk about their experiences with assault. And some of what Quadira points to here with slut shaming, ignoring, or blaming is part of the process, of part of the reasoning why. Some of it is that the experience of reporting is one where people just get questioned again and again and again and again. And it's partially because, the reporting process is a reporting process that's sort of been captured by law. And, the legal frameworks, there's a lot that's great about law, but legal frameworks, the basic logic is you get two people to argue vehemently against one another, and then a disinterested party evaluates the two sides. And like, the job is to advocate for your position of each person. Like that moves people really far away from each other really, really quickly. And so envisioning alternate models here would be really important. But it was really interesting, the many reasons why like people chose not to report their assaults. And it wasn't just experiences of slut shaming or, the difficulty of reporting. Take Adam's story. Like, Adam didn't report about his boyfriend basically raping him because the relationship was really valuable to him. And he decided he'd rather weather it. Adam was a little bit unique. In the survey research that was led by Klon Bellins, we found that the vast majority of people told someone about their experience of assault. They just didn't tell the university. So, 70 to 80% are telling somebody about the experiences that they're having. People who don't tell others, the most common reason they didn't tell others was because they felt like it wasn't serious enough. So those are often experiences of like being groped at a party and they were like, it was definitely an assault. It wasn't that serious for me. I didn't really talk about it. And one of the things that we found was that there's a lot of community level mental health burden because of this. Almost everyone knows someone who experienced an assault, and they're carrying this tremendous weight for their friends. They're not mental health counselors, but they feel some degree of obligation to provide help for their friends. And it's not just the burden of being assaulted. It's also this broad burden of the experience of assault across an entire community of people. And part of the reason we want to focus so much on prevention is to kind of lower that community mental health burden and community suffering. And so thinking about like the many reasons why people aren't reporting can help us look through that. And a lot of it is that most people are assaulted by somebody they know. Most people are assaulted by somebody they've had some kind of physical contact with before. And it's very difficult for them if the process is deeply adversarial in its design to actually find a way through, to have a conversation about what happened to them in order to sort of restore themselves to feel a little bit more whole. Because there's this sense of like accusing someone of assault is like the worst thing you could possibly do. It's like calling someone a racist and like, can you imagine anything worse? And we need to get to a point where we say like, actually calling someone a racist isn't that terrible because there are a lot of racist people out there and they need to work on their racism, right? And racism is bad, but there are a lot of racists. And so because racism is bad doesn't mean that we shouldn't call out racism. It means that we should address racism. And, by analogy, I think thinking about ways in which we can have conversations about problematic sexual experiences, difficult sexual experiences, and experiences that we would call assault that could be community building rather than community destroying has to be part of our vision.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And so we have about 6 minutes left. I just thought that Monica's question is a really intriguing one, and I'd love to get your thoughts. Monica asked, much of your research in academia and in this space in general center around qualitative data, focus groups, experiential surveying, small samples, and open-ended questions. If you were to facilitate a larger population research, what kinds of questions would you try to answer? Yeah.
I'm really hoping, Monica, that you have $2.5 million to give me.
As do I.
Yeah, you could give some to Chris too. But whether the work is qualitative or quantitative, I think that you actually point to the question that we end the book with. You know, the whole book is about how context produces vulnerability, and yet, ironically, like we were pretty much only working in one context. I mean, we were like, you know, Barnard and Columbia are on opposite sides of Broadway, but like it's pretty much one campus. And so I think that the question which I would like to see looked at both ethnographically and quantitatively is about how the variation in the campus characteristics is related to a risk environment. And the data sets that we might be able to do this with actually block us from doing it. So when the American Association of Universities did their multi-campus survey and they archived the data, they stripped the institutional identifiers because they do not want people to do cross-campus comparative work because nobody wants to be the rapiest campus, right? And similarly, like the American College Health Association in their survey, they will not, you can look at campus characteristics in general, like the size of the student body or the composition, but you can't actually look at the surrounding geography. So I think that work, and feel like this is what I'm working on now, is trying to figure out how to do this. Because there's not really a good data set, but I think that quantitative work that looks at across multiple campuses and figures out how not just the campus microenvironment, but like the physical space of campus, or the physical space of the surrounding environment. I think that that's really like the future of this work.
Yeah.
That's a great question. If you're an aspiring public health student, you will go far.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that, you know, that's one of the gaps in the data and in the analysis that's happening around, you know, questions like this, around the broader impacts of sex education, you know, beyond just pregnancy and disease prevention, it's really astounding. And so, you know, I appreciate you asking that question, Monica, and responding to that question, Jennifer, because I think that we do need to do a better job of asking these questions, getting the data, and being able to tell a different story. So we are basically at time. I am just so grateful to you both for taking the time to spend with us. Your book is such a tremendous accomplishment. I commend you for your work and for the thoughtfulness in which you describe these situations. And I'm really grateful for the new language and the ideas that you've entered into the discourse. And I you know, want to just, again, appreciate everyone who joined us this evening, who have stayed with us throughout the entire program. Thank you so much. It is really wonderful and gratifying to have such robust interest and engagement in this conversation. And I hope that you found it enjoyable. We are planning to hold further conversations with leading experts, thought leaders, and movement innovators to really explore these ideas of what sex education as a vehicle for social change can mean on some of these core questions like this one. And so if you enjoyed the event, please come back for the next one. We'll be talking about sex positivity, pleasure, and consent in sex education. I also ask you once more, if you enjoyed the event, to please visit www.siecus.org/donate to make a contribution to support our work. Thank you, thank you, thank you so much. Have a wonderful evening. And this will conclude our event today. We will be saving the recording. It will go live. We'll be saving the chat. So thank you all. Have a wonderful evening.
Thank you so much.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.